I actually studied Italian for a month in the Università di Urbino. Yeah, it was really great, but it's like in the last century. But maybe if I came again, I would try to study again. I know, il flauto, spaghetti Alfredo, allegro ma non troppo. Yeah, so what can I do for you?
When I was teaching, I did have a teaching job. There was a time in my life I thought I needed a real job, and I was very happy to get a full-time job, tenure track position in the State University of New York in Potsdam, which is upstate New York. Lots of fresh air, but very far away from New York City. But I had students there that really wanted to, they were very interested in learning, but everything was in their head. So I would actually require them to go dance to pop music and rock music, and we would dance together, and they thought this was really strange, but you have to relate to how the music makes your body move, make you feel. So this is it's a very important dimension. You're not just playing your embouchure, a little bit of breath, reading the music, interpreting. It's got to be a whole thing. That's important. People are always interested in how somebody makes decisions. How do they do something? Why did I come to Germany? How did I start playing flute? All this. I think apart from the details that my third grade teacher played the flute and she was pretty and I wanted to play the flute. And I came to Germany because I had a friend studying there and all that. The point was that basically I followed things that interested me. And that led me to a very roundabout path, which makes it really difficult for interviewers who want a concise, I did this, and here I am. My life was nothing like that. I didn't set out to be a soloist. I set out to be a good musician, play with chamber music and see what happens. And suddenly, not suddenly, all around this winding road. But I think what one could take away from that is that you can actually carve your own path. And I think everybody should follow what they're interested in. If you're really interested in being an orchestra musician, there is still a chance to be an orchestra musician. Yes, orchestras are closing down and folding up, but there are still orchestras, and you follow that. You hang around with orchestras, you seek out orchestra players. There wasn't anyone for me to seek out in my path of coming to Europe and trying to find out a way. But looking back, I did have teachers, flute teachers and other teachers who were outside a norm, and they were also doing interesting things. So I think at some level, I was encouraged to just follow my interests, and that works. At least it's worked for me, and I think if it works for one person, it's possible to work for others. So it doesn't have to just be a given path. I thought that by now, I'm over 60, and by now I thought I would be teaching in a university because this is what I just thought I would do. But I kept having interesting things to do, in this concert here and this concert tour there, for which I'm very thankful. But that means I have to find my own way to pass on the knowledge that I've learned. And I'm going to have to create another way, whether we're talking with a lot of older musicians and intellectuals, and so in Europe where they have to stop their real job at 65. What do you do after that? Well, you make podcasts, you give lectures, you make master classes, you keep working. Like about now is where you figure out what you have to offer and what you can do. And as long as you can still play and teach, there are all kinds of possibilities open. So this is something that continually inspires me, because there's not one path to make your life. I come from a family of teachers, and it was always assumed that I would be a teacher. I was supposed to be a very good flutist, but eventually I should get married and have kids and just have a flute studio and teach wherever my husband would go. Well, this didn't work out. But I've been teaching since I was 13, because I was one of the only kids in my primary school that was taking lessons. And so I would teach the 9-year-olds. So I would get $1 for a half an hour lesson. And I really liked that, because I was always a couple of years ahead of these kids. And I just kept teaching. I taught all through junior high, high school, college. In graduate school, I got a teaching assistantship. And that was always a way. When I first came to Europe, I started teaching at a children's school, private lessons, but for all ages. And I just have always been doing that. And of course, along the way, I got a teaching job at a college and at a conservatoire. The last official teaching job I had was teaching at the Duisburg campus of the Folkwang Hochschule in Essen. And this was just a smaller campus that it was impossible to actually build a good flute class. We had no chamber music and no orchestra. And so at some point I realized I actually came to Europe to play. So that's what I'm going to do. And I quit that, and I've been freelance since then. So that's actually since 1998. At some point I really missed teaching, and my percussionist with whom I was working was also starting a new school for music, and I thought I would help out at the beginning to just get some kids and I ended up staying there for 10 years. And I had some adorable kids from 4 years old till maybe 17 or 18. And of course, I've always taught privately and done master classes. But I really like it, and it's just been hard to teach on a regular basis, because in the last 6-7 years, I've just been touring a lot, and it's hard you can't teach kids if you're not there regularly. But of course, for adults, I teach either in master classes or they come specially for intensive working sessions. So for me, the teaching is really an important part.
In the 60s and the 50s, there was a lot of experimenting, like what can we do on the flute? And that was one of the things. So, well, the reason, there are a number of reasons to explore these things, not just for fun and to drive your band director crazy, but, the reason I got into it is because at some point you've done all the repertoire. We don't have, when I was growing up, we didn't have so many things. We had Mozart and the Baroque things and Ibert and these concertos, and then what? And when I went to school, I met very interesting people that were composers, and they were trying different things, and they showed me different things to do on the flute. So it's just more interesting. That's one thing. I was just curious, and I would find new scores and see how to decipher what does this mean. If there's an arrow above the sound, all these pitches between the normal pitches, we can do some of that. But the other thing is, if you learn some of these techniques, it's also good for your classical flute playing. So have you done overtones? Like overblowing?
We've some of them.
Okay, so this is a good place to start.
Yeah,
so if you finger a low C, Do, no? Try this together.
In graduate school, the flute studio was on the same floor as a lot of the composers. And so I had a lot of contact with people who were exploring new things. And this was the late 70s, which was still very experimental. So a lot of my friends were making scores built on kiosks or on pyramids, and we'd play outdoors or in galleries and interpret partly graphic scores and partly games that you follow the rules. There's a really great name for this. It's called composer-controlled performer indeterminacy. So it's not a free-for-all. The composer has this plan, but there's a lot of choices that were left up to the performer. So this was very intriguing. At the same time, I was also playing traverso Baroque flute. We learned that. I studied for a couple of years. I played with a lutist. I had the audacity to play a concert for Baroque flute and lute, even though other people have spent years. But this was just starting to become very, very popular. And when I went to Europe, I was trying to decide whether to continue with that and or work with composers. I had met Stockhausen by that time, Sarajevo shortly afterwards. And finally, I appreciated the exploratory world of the new music, the things happening now, and the directions, the possibilities of making music right now. So that kind of influenced my choices. Of course, I learned my Mozart and Ibert, and I played the concertos, and I won a concerto competition, and I've done my Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach and, all that. But it's kind of like, okay, I've done that, so what's now? And I wanted to do new things. And once you learn all that repertoire, what? Oh, let's learn some quarter tones. Oh, you mean breath sounds are a thing? Oh, okay, good, yeah. So, and it was just fun. I was just curious to do it. Oh, shakuhachi music. Oh, you can do that on flute. This is actually ancient sounds. These are sounds that have been around for 3,000 years and they have their own notation. But for the West, it's like, put a little air, a lot of air. How do we notate this? But to try to figure out what the possibilities are, that to me kept it interesting, because it's just a flute, So many things you can do once you open up. And this is called a jet whistle. So, and you can do it like, get different things, or depending on where you do it, it's a different kind of sound. There you go. Yeah, there's different ones. And people, you can do actually kind of these whistle tones inside the flute. And this was mostly developed in Italy, in fact. Sciarrino, very famous composer. And he had people doing, it's kind of a slowed down warm up. If you go, then you don't hear anything. But if you go very quietly, and I'm changing in my mouth. You have so many possibilities, but you can't just stay, if it doesn't work, then you have to try something different. Mm-hmm. Don't keep trying the same thing. Same thing with your mouth. If your sound doesn't work, don't keep trying. See, maybe do I have to change this? Do I have to change this? Mm-hmm. There's so many things to do. Do that once. Yeah. And now change the mouth, change the inside of your mouth. There you go. Which brings us to a whole other thing of air sounds. Because of course you've studied to try to get a clear flute sound. And then at some point composers discovered that air sounds are actually kind of cool. And you can do a lot of things like, and the thing, all of these exercises or these fun things to do, you need to, this is just a tube. This is just a tube of air, and there's an opening and there's keys, and you have to be very experimental. You have to not be afraid to, oh no, my embouchure, oh my thing, you'll always get it back. You'll always get it back. Well, what I'm really interested in teaching is passing on all this knowledge that I've gotten from all of my flute teachers, as well as my music teachers, not to mention philosophers along the way, because I think there's so much more that goes into making music than just getting the right fingering and the right embouchure and, of course, breathing. This is all really, really important. But I'm also more interested lately in the language of music, and this is nothing new, but what's new is that we're paying more attention to the different languages, the different interpretive possibilities for music of the 20th century. And I've explained that somewhere else. but everybody is still using the same kind of notation, except if you're doing graphic notation. But just playing quarter notes and half notes or crotchets and these things, the same thing that you've been using for Bach and Mozart and Debussy and Stockhausen and Sarajevo and Kosigi and all these things, but each person uses it in a different context. And it's very interesting to figure out what happens. We talk about music happening between the notes, but you also have to know the whole context. And even if in general, the flutists today, high school kids can play the repertoire that we were struggling with in graduate school, but sometimes they don't understand the importance of what was Berio trying to say with the sequenza. Why do we play Messiaen like this? Why do we play Varese like this? And for that matter, going back to what was new about Mozart, what was the new music aspect about him? Why was he different than Bach or C.P. Bach? And all these things, you can teach that across the board. You don't have to just limit it to flutists. So I'm really interested in examining this bigger picture. And I think that if you pay attention to these different contexts of music and the different languages, the different accents, it makes the music really come alive. You really can differentiate between composers and compositions. I have an example here of Messiaen, the blackbird, le merle noir, which most of you flutists should know about. And we have a section here where there are sixteenths tied to an eighth note or tied to another 16th note, and there are bar lines with this irregular rhythm. And if we were approaching this as a Baroque piece or as some traditional classic one, we would see this first 16th note as an upbeat to the next measure. Da, da, and then maybe the units that are beamed together, eighth note and 16th note. Maybe this is a group of 3, this is a group of 4 16th notes, this is a group of 3. So we'd go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Yes, and this is correct, but if we actually did it with those accents, it would sound like this. Which is kind of jazzy, and you might like it, but this is not what Messiaen had intended, as we know from the traditions, because we were making recordings while Messiaen was still alive. And we know that Messiaen was interested in rhythm as duration of sound. So in this case, he didn't want those accents. And if you'll check most of your favorite flute players, they did it without the accents. The piano in this place is doing kind of a canon with the rhythm. So our duty then is to interpret it more straight. We can have a little lift, we can have a little nuance, but the idea is durations of note instead of real rhythm. So we have another example of performance practice. The most popular flute solo ever, Syrinx of Debussy. If we were to interpret the rhythm as exactly as we did by Messiaen, it would sound, we would have to subdivide. We'd have this dotted eighth and the 2 32nds, and it would be like this. Which is not very interesting, and which is how we don't hear it. The point is not whether you use vibrato or not vibrato. We could do the same thing with, maybe. But that's not the idea. Debussy wasn't interested in duration of sound the way Messiaen was. So he was, yes, you have to be accurate. And if you listen to Marcel Moïse describe this, you have to do the eyebrows, da, 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 dee, da, da. And you have to keep the rhythm, that it's a 3/4, it's da, 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 dee, da, da, dee, da, da, da. So a lot of flutists like to make it a 4/4 measure, da, 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 dee, da, da, dee, da, da, da. That's also not the score, but it's a lot more flexible than what we just had with Messiaen. So, for example, So I was accurate rhythmically, but I wasn't mechanical. And I wasn't caring if there's this 32nd was a little more or this 16th was a little more. But it's a totally different interpretation. You can probably do a lot of variations on that. But you should keep 3/4 time. You should keep, in my edition here, there's a tenuto on the D, da, dee, dee. So you have more weight on the first note. So in this performance practice, it's more related to our traditional classical performance practice that some notes have more weight than others. And in Messiaen's case, he didn't want that. It wasn't based on the rhythm. It wasn't based on these weighted things. It was more da dee da da da, a more transcendent atmosphere, which you could only get if you ignored the beats of the bar lines. So those are two very basic differences for performance practice. Short version of how I came to Europe. I had met people from the Stockhausen group, and we were planning to make a chamber music group together. Finally, that didn't work because the Stockhausen musicians were only supposed to be playing Stockhausen at the time. And then someone recommended that I do a solo contest in Rotterdam. It's called the Gaudiamus competition. It's for all the instruments. And I hadn't actually thought about doing solo contemporary music, but I had played some. I had played Berlioz, Varese. Stockhausen had just published In Freundschaft, so I learned that. And I knew a Japanese piece, and you had to play 2 Dutch composers. And I just did it to give myself something to do. And lo and behold, I won a prize, and I started making concerts with another prize winner. And that became kind of a thing. But even then, I didn't see myself as a soloist. I was still trying to make groups and do chamber music. But one thing led to another, and in the meantime, I started working with more composers. I had met Kaya Sarajevo at Darmstadt, and we started working. Stockhausen had written a piece for me right after the Gaudiamus competition, and then there were a lot more. So I just stayed and I started doing other things. I kept thinking that if things don't work out, I'll just go back to America and I will teach at a university. But there was always something interesting to do. So here I am 40 years later. Yeah, who'd have thought? So I think what you can learn from my life is that it's possible to make a life as a musician, even if you don't follow the normal rules. I wasn't allowed to go to a music conservatory because my parents wanted me to have a liberal arts education, but I had very good teachers, and afterwards I specialized more in music. I didn't go to any major competitions, and I didn't, where you go to a competition, you win a prize, you get an agent. I didn't do any of those things, but I kept following things that I was interested in. I was interested in this Japanese music that I had found in a store. I've always been curious. I've looked for scores, and I wrote the publisher to see if this man had any more music for flute. And it turned out that he wrote me a concerto and invited me to Japan. So, I mean, these are things that you can't plan. But in my life, they followed because I was following things that were interesting to me. Anytime I did something because I was supposed to, like you're supposed to audition for that orchestra because that would give you legitimacy, nothing happened. I mean, this did not work. The only things that happened were if I was really interested in pursuing this path. So I encourage everybody to
Yes.
find out what they're really interested in, and it'll turn out. So another really good example of a special way of interpreting that is to have an idea of performance practice is in connection with Varese's Density 21.5. It's been popularly spoken of as the antithesis to the syrinx. It's a backward syrinx. But what's really important, what makes it backwards, He has written in here, always strictly in time, follow metronomic indications. And this is, of course, the school. Verez was ahead of his time. He was going toward electronic music and musique concrète, and this is the tradition that Messiaen and then later Stockhausen all followed in. But already with this piece, which he wrote for Georges Barrère and his platinum flute, he was interested in durations of sound. It's not Baroque music, it's not Romantic music, and it doesn't need interpreting in the way we'd have to interpret the Böhm Fantasy or something like that, or even Fauré, these other ones. It's not up to us to go. We don't have to add to it. He's been very, very exact about the duration, about the dynamics. In the second measure, we already see a triplet that starts with a 16th and then goes to a dotted 8th. So he doesn't want it to sound like triplets swinging. So it's up to us to keep the tempo strictly in time and get this phrase the way he wants it. So we'll try. Too much talking, but anyway. Etc. People argue whether you should have vibrato or not vibrato. There are recordings around with vibrato, but even then, I think it shouldn't distract from the notes. So if you have vibrato, just a little for color, but not to interfere with the rhythmic durations and the proportions that he set up. So that's just a taste. We can go into it much more in detail in the master classes. So thank you for listening.